Sometimes danger doesn't bark. Sometimes, it waits quietly beneath your feet. Snow drifted sideways across Highway 17 as the midnight coach rolled through northern Ontario, its headlights cutting pale tunnels through the freezing dark. The storm had started an hour earlier outside Sudbury, soft at first, then harder now, sharp pellets of ice tapping against the windows like nervous fingers. Inside the bus, the air smelled faintly of wet wool, diesel, and stale coffee from paper cups abandoned near the aisle. Most passengers had fallen asleep long ago. A university student leaned against the glass with earbuds still glowing blue. An older man in a plaid jacket snored softly near the rear emergency exit. Somewhere near the middle seats, a woman quietly turned the pages of a paperback under a dim reading light while the driver hummed along to low country radio crackling through static. Everything about the night felt ordinary. Safe. Tired. Forgettable. Which was why nobody noticed the dog at first. She lay curled beneath the last row on the right side of the bus, hidden between shadow and steel supports, nearly invisible except for the faint reflection of highway lights catching her dark coat. A Doberman. Lean and black with rust markings above her eyes and along her chest. Her body was still, disciplined even in sleep, paws tucked beneath her like she had learned long ago how to disappear in plain sight. No leash. No tags visible. No sound except the slow rhythm of breathing. Most passengers assumed she belonged to someone. Nobody asked questions. In Canada, people often minded their own business during winter travel. Especially at midnight. The bus rolled north through kilometers of frozen pine forest while snow gathered thick along the shoulders of the road. Then, somewhere outside a small inspection checkpoint near North Bay, the Doberman's eyes opened. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. Amber eyes adjusting to movement beyond the fogged windows. The bus slowed with a hiss of air brakes. Red and blue lights shimmered faintly across the snowbanks outside. Ontario Provincial Police. Routine winter stop. The driver sighed under his breath and reached for his logbook. Evening check, he muttered toward the passengers, though almost nobody was awake enough to care. Boots crunched outside. Flashlights moved through blowing snow. Then the Doberman slowly lifted her head. Her ears twitched once. The movement was small enough that nobody saw it except the woman reading the paperback. She glanced downward briefly, expecting maybe curiosity or hunger from the dog. Instead, the animal stared toward the front luggage rack with an intensity that felt strangely human. Not fear. Not aggression. Recognition. The woman frowned softly and followed the dog's gaze toward a large black duffel bag sitting alone beside the front exit stairs. She hadn't noticed it before. Maybe someone had moved it during the last stop in Parry Sound. Before she could think more about it, the folding bus door opened with a hydraulic groan and cold air flooded inside. Snowflakes spiraled beneath the ceiling lights as Officer Ethan Mercer stepped aboard. Tall. Broad-shouldered beneath a dark winter patrol jacket dusted with snow. His flashlight remained lowered out of habit rather than threat. He looked like a man carrying exhaustion carefully, the kind police officers wore after too many overnight shifts and too many things they preferred not remembering. His pale green eyes scanned the passengers calmly while wind tugged at the collar of his coat. "Evening, folks," he said quietly in a Northern Ontario accent softened by years on the road. "Just a quick inspection tonight." A few tired nods answered him. Someone coughed near the back. Ethan stepped farther inside, boots leaving wet marks along the rubber floor. Then he stopped. Not because of the passengers. Because of the dog. The Doberman had risen now, standing perfectly still beneath the seat. Watching him. Her posture changed the instant their eyes met. Not defensive. Not uncertain. Focused. Ethan's expression tightened almost invisibly. Years earlier, before highway patrol, he had worked alongside K-9 units near Ottawa. You never forgot certain details. The way trained dogs held eye contact. The stillness before detection. The restraint. This dog had all of it. Snow hissed against the bus windows behind him while silence slowly spread through the aisle. Then Ethan spoke the words that made every passenger finally look down. "Who has a trained dog here?" For 3 long seconds, nobody answered him. The bus seemed to shrink beneath the hum of ceiling vents and the soft rattle of sleet against glass. Ethan kept his flashlight lowered, but his eyes stayed fixed on the Doberman. The dog had not moved from beneath the seat. She simply watched him with an intensity that settled deep in his chest like an old memory returning. Uninvited. A younger officer might have laughed it off. A stray hitching warmth on a winter bus. But Ethan had spent too many years around working dogs to ignore instinct when it stood quietly in front of him. Anyone, he asked again, calmer this time. A man near the rear shrugged beneath his parka. Thought she belonged to the driver. Not mine, the driver answered immediately from the wheel. Never saw her board. Murmurs spread softly through the rows now. Passengers leaned into aisles, blinking awake, trying to make sense of the animal hidden in shadow. The woman with the paperback closed her book slowly. She hasn't made a sound the whole trip, she whispered. Ethan nodded once but said nothing. His attention shifted briefly toward the black duffel bag resting beside the front exit steps. Large enough for camping gear. Or tools. Or nothing at all. Snow blew hard beyond the windshield, turning the checkpoint lights into blurred halos floating in white darkness. Then the Doberman stepped forward. Not toward the passengers. Toward Ethan. Her paws moved silently across the rubber floor as she emerged from beneath the seat, lean muscles visible beneath her short coat. Even exhausted, she carried herself with discipline. No frantic energy. No begging for food. Every movement looked measured. Intentional. She stopped less than a meter from Ethan and sat down. Perfectly straight. The officer's jaw tightened slightly. That posture. That stillness. Somebody had trained her well. A younger constable standing outside the bus door shifted uneasily. You know this dog, sir? Ethan didn't answer immediately. He crouched slowly instead, keeping his hands visible. The Doberman's amber eyes never left his face. Up close, he noticed faint salt stains across her coat from old snow and road slush. Her ribs showed slightly beneath the harness straps hidden under her fur. She had been traveling for a while. Then he saw it. A narrow band of faded tactical nylon tucked beneath her neck. Not a pet collar. Working gear. Worn smooth with age. Ethan felt something cold move quietly through him. The dog lowered her head once, almost imperceptibly, then turned toward the front of the bus again. Toward the duffel bag. Her ears sharpened. The muscles along her shoulders stiffened. She did not bark. That bothered Ethan more than barking would have. Trained detection dogs rarely panicked when they found something dangerous. They focused. Sir, the younger constable asked again. Ethan stood slowly, eyes narrowing toward the unattended bag. How long's that been there? The driver frowned into the rearview mirror. Not sure. Picked up passengers in Perry Sound around 10:30. Could belong to anyone. Did someone get off before North Bay? A tired college student lifted his hand halfway. Ah, yeah. One guy. Maybe 40 minutes ago at a fuel stop near French River. Ethan turned. You remember what he looked like? Not really. The student hesitated. Baseball cap maybe. Gray coat. Didn't talk much. Outside, wind howled across the highway shoulder, rocking the bus slightly on its suspension. Ethan's radio crackled softly against his jacket. Somewhere beyond the storm, transport trucks thundered through the dark carrying lumber, fuel, groceries, ordinary lives moving north through winter. Inside the bus, nobody seemed ordinary anymore. The Doberman rose again. This time she walked directly between Ethan and the duffel bag before stopping in the aisle. Blocking the path. Her breathing slowed. Controlled. But her eyes never blinked. Ethan felt the old sensation return from years he tried not to think about. The feeling that something invisible had just entered the room before everyone else noticed it. Then the dog trembled once. Small enough most people missed it. Ethan didn't. And suddenly the cold outside no longer felt like the worst thing waiting on that highway. The trembling lasted less than a second, but Ethan felt it like a warning bell buried beneath years of winter silence. He lifted one hand slowly toward the younger constable outside the bus. Nobody touches that bag. The constable straightened immediately, snow collecting along the shoulders of his reflective jacket. You think it is dangerous? Ethan kept his eyes on the Doberman. I think the dog does. A hush settled over the passengers now, the kind that spreads when ordinary people realize a normal night may no longer be normal at all. The woman with the paperback pulled her scarf tighter around her neck. Somewhere near the rear seats, somebody quietly muttered a prayer in French. The bus heater rattled overhead, pushing warm dry air through vents that suddenly smelled too much like heated plastic and diesel fuel. Ethan took a careful step toward the aisle. The Doberman moved instantly. Not aggressive. Not frantic. She simply shifted sideways and blocked him again, body rigid between the officer and the black duffel bag near the front stairs. Her eyes lifted toward him once more. Focused. Intentional. Ethan stopped. Every nerve in his body remembered training fields outside Ottawa nearly 15 years earlier. Cold mornings. Detection drills. Veteran handlers teaching younger officers to trust what the dog noticed before human instinct could catch up. Most civilians imagined working dogs barked wildly at danger. Real detection dogs often did the opposite. They became still. Quiet. Controlled. Exactly like this. Snow slammed harder against the windshield outside, and the highway lights beyond the checkpoint blurred beneath thick curtains of white. Visibility had dropped badly. The driver glanced nervously toward Ethan. Officer, should we clear the bus? Ethan did not answer right away. He crouched slightly instead, studying the Doberman more carefully now. Her breathing remained steady, but faint tension rolled beneath the surface of her muscles. Then he noticed something else. Her nose kept twitching toward the duffel bag, then briefly toward the heating vents near the floor. Scent flow. Air circulation. She was tracking something airborne. A cold weight settled into Ethan's stomach. Not panic. Memory. There had been another winter once. Edmonton. A roadside checkpoint outside the city nearly 11 years ago. Ethan had still been with Tactical Response back then, partnered with a veteran handler named Nolan Pierce. During a vehicle inspection, Nolan's Shepherd had frozen exactly like this moments before officers uncovered homemade chemical triggers hidden inside construction equipment. Nobody died that night because the dog refused to move. Ethan had never forgotten the smell afterward. Sharp. Bitter. Almost metallic beneath the cold air. He inhaled carefully now. At first he caught only wet wool coats and road salt melting from boots. Then faintly beneath it all came something else. Almonds. Metal. Chemical residue hiding under diesel fumes. Ethan's face hardened almost imperceptibly. The younger constable noticed immediately. Sir. Ethan stood fully this time and reached for his shoulder radio. Dispatch, this is Mercer at Highway 17 checkpoint northbound near kilometer marker 248. I need temporary containment and canine support immediately. Static crackled through the radio. Copy that, Mercer. Nature of concern. Ethan looked at the dog standing silently beneath the fluorescent bus lights. Possible hazardous materials. The passengers stirred uneasily at those words. An older woman clutched her purse tighter. A young man near the center aisle pulled his phone halfway out, then stopped when Ethan raised a firm hand. No videos right now. Everybody stays calm. Outside, another police cruiser rolled into the checkpoint with tires crunching over packed snow. Red and blue lights washed through the bus windows in slow pulses, bathing tired faces in alternating colors. Yet through all of it, the Doberman never once looked away from the unattended bag. Ethan took one cautious step backward toward the door. This time the dog allowed it. As if distance, not approach, had been the correct choice all along. The realization sent another chill through him. She was not guarding the bag from people. She was trying to keep people away from it. Then suddenly the Doberman lifted her head toward the ceiling vents and released the softest sound Ethan had heard all night. Not a bark. Not a growl. Just a low whine that carried the weight of something trying very hard to warn them before it was too late. The storm swallowed sound outside the checkpoint, turning the world beyond the bus windows into shifting white static. Snow swept across the highway in long ghostly ribbons beneath the flashing police lights, and somewhere far off, a transport truck blasted its horn before disappearing into the dark. Inside the coach, however, every small noise suddenly felt too loud. A zipper sliding shut. Nervous breathing. The soft crackle of Ethan Mercer's radio against his winter jacket. Fear had entered quietly, but now it sat in every seat. Ethan stepped down from the bus slowly, careful not to slam the folding door behind him. The Doberman remained just inside the aisle, watching him through the glass with unbroken focus. Snow gathered across Ethan's shoulders the moment he stepped into the wind. Sergeant Claire Bouchard climbed out of the newly arrived cruiser, her boots crunching over packed ice. She was in her late 40s, sharp-eyed, practical, the kind of officer Northern Ontario detachments depended on during long winters and worse nights. "What have we got?" she asked, pulling her toque lower against the wind. Ethan glanced back toward the bus. Unattended duffel bag. Dog reaction. Possible chemical indicators. Claire frowned immediately. Bomb dog. No handler. Dog showed up on the bus alone. Even saying it aloud sounded strange. Claire looked through the windshield toward the Doberman standing silently near the front stairs. That animal. Ethan nodded once. She is trained. The wind howled harder between the cruisers, rattling road signs along the shoulder. Ethan inhaled again carefully. There it was beneath the snow and diesel. Faint. Metallic. Sharp enough to stir old memories he spent years burying beneath routine highway patrol shifts and sleepless nights. Claire noticed his expression darken. You smell it too. Ethan stared toward the bus lights glowing against the storm. Maybe. But deep down he already knew. The smell dragged him backward through time to another frozen roadside years ago. Edmonton. Tactical response. A freezing industrial checkpoint outside the city limits. He remembered Nolan Pierce kneeling beside his shepherd in swirling snow while officers laughed about false alarms. Then the dog froze. Completely still. 15 minutes later they uncovered concealed trigger components hidden inside equipment cases bound for downtown transit routes. Nolan had trusted the dog before he trusted the evidence. That trust saved lives. Ethan remembered the look Nolan gave him afterward while steam rose from their coffee cups in the bitter cold. Dogs do not guess, the older handler had said quietly. People do. A gust of wind snapped Ethan back to the present. Inside the bus, passengers had started shifting anxiously toward the windows, watching officers gather outside. One young man raised his phone until Claire pointed sharply downward. No recording right now. The young man obeyed immediately. Ethan keyed his radio again. Dispatch, upgrade response. Request hazardous materials and explosives unit from North Bay Detachment. Static answered first, then a tired voice. Estimated arrival 45 minutes due to storm conditions. Ethan glanced toward the dark highway stretching north through endless forest. 45 minutes felt very far away tonight. Claire folded her arms against the cold. We cannot leave civilians on that bus if you think there is contamination. Ethan nodded slowly. Agreed. Yet something kept bothering him. The dog had not tried escaping the bus. She had not hidden. She stayed close to the bag while keeping everyone else away from it. Like she understood exactly where the danger ended and where safety began. That level of control did not come from ordinary obedience training. It came from operational experience. Ethan looked back through the frosted glass again. The Doberman had not moved from her position. Snowlight reflected softly in her amber eyes. Then suddenly she turned her head toward the rear seats. A second later, Ethan saw it too. An older passenger in a green winter coat had quietly stood up and started reaching for the overhead luggage compartment above the unattended duffel bag. "Sir," Ethan shouted instantly. "Do not touch anything." The man froze mid-motion, startled by the sharpness in Ethan's voice. Inside the bus, every passenger turned at once. The Doberman stepped forward immediately, placing herself directly beneath the luggage rack. Silent. Rigid. Watching the men carefully but without aggression. The old passenger slowly raised both hands. "I was only getting my medication bag." Ethan exhaled carefully and climbed halfway back onto the bus stairs, keeping his movements slow. "I understand, sir. Just stay where you are for me." The old man nodded nervously and sat back down. The Doberman relaxed only slightly afterward, though her eyes never left the overhead compartment. Ethan felt a cold realization settle deeper into his chest now. The dog was not reacting randomly. She was tracking proximity, measuring movement, anticipating risk before it happened. And somewhere beneath the scent of snow and highway salt, something dangerous was waiting very quietly inside that bus. Within minutes, the quiet checkpoint became a pocket of controlled chaos buried in the northern Ontario storm. Police cruisers angled themselves across the highway with emergency lights flashing through thick snowfall, painting the drifts in waves of red and blue. Transport trucks slowed as they passed, their engines rumbling low through the night like distant thunder before vanishing into the white dark beyond the barricades. Ethan Mercer stood near the open bus door while officers guided passengers carefully into the heated roadside maintenance station 30 meters away. The building was small and plain, little more than a winter operations shelter with humming fluorescent lights and the smell of burnt coffee lingering in the air, but tonight it felt like the only warm place left in the province. "Watch your footing," Claire Bouchard called over the wind as an elderly couple stepped carefully across the icy pavement. A young mother wrapped her scarf tighter around her shoulders while holding the hand of a sleepy teenage boy. One university student kept asking nervous questions nobody answered directly. Another passenger tried calling family in Sudbury, but the storm kept interrupting the signal. Fear moved quietly among them now. Not screaming panic. Just uncertainty. The kind that settles into people when they realize they came very close to something they still do not fully understand. Through all of it, the Doberman remained inside. The bus alone. Ethan noticed that immediately. She had not followed the passengers out. Had not searched for warmth. She stayed near the front aisle beneath the overhead rack, staring toward the unattended duffel bag as snowlight flickered through the windows around her. One constable approached the bus steps carrying a thermal blanket. "Should I bring the dog out too?" Ethan answered too quickly. "No," the younger officer blinked. Ethan softened his tone. "Not yet." He could not fully explain why. Some instinct told him removing her now would be like silencing the only voice in the room still telling the truth. The wind pushed icy needles across Ethan's face as he climbed halfway back onto the bus. Warm stale air wrapped around him again immediately. Diesel fumes. Wet fabric. Faint chemical bitterness still hiding underneath everything else. The Doberman glanced toward him once but did not move from her position. "Easy, girl," Ethan murmured quietly. Her ears twitched at the sound of his voice. Up close now, he noticed tiny flecks of gray hidden around her muzzle beneath the black fur. Older than he first thought. Experienced. Her tactical collar sat worn and faded against her neck, almost buried beneath her coat. Ethan crouched carefully several feet away. "Who trained you?" he whispered under his breath. The dog lowered her head slightly, then turned her eyes back toward the bag again. Focused. Always focused. Ethan followed her line of sight. The black duffel looked painfully ordinary beneath the dim interior lights. No markings. No movement. Just an abandoned piece of luggage sitting quietly where someone had left it nearly an hour earlier. Yet the closer Ethan stood to it, the stronger the metallic scent became. Not overwhelming. Just enough to stir memory and unease together. Behind him, Claire climbed aboard holding a tablet wrapped in a waterproof sleeve. "We checked the passenger manifest," she said quietly. "No dog registered. No owner claims. But we may have something on the men who exited near French River." Ethan looked up. Claire pulled up grainy fuel station security footage. A tall man in a gray winter coat appeared on the screen beside the bus entrance. Ball cap low. Face partially hidden. Nothing unusual at first glance. Yet Ethan noticed one thing immediately. The man never carried a duffel bag when leaving the station. He left it behind intentionally, Ethan said softly. Claire nodded grimly. "Looks that way." Silence settled heavily between them while snow hissed against the bus roof overhead. Then suddenly the Doberman stood up. Every muscle along her body tightened at once. Ethan's pulse sharpened instantly. The dog took 2 slow steps backward away from the bag for the first time all night. Not panic. Distance. Deliberate distance. Her breathing quickened slightly now, controlled but urgent. Ethan felt cold move through his chest. "Everybody off the perimeter," he said immediately into his radio. "Now." Claire did not argue. Outside, officers began pushing the safety line farther back across the checkpoint. The storm swallowed their voices beneath the wind while emergency lights spun wildly through the snow. Ethan stayed where he was another second longer, eyes fixed on the Doberman. She looked back at him once. And in that moment, beneath the flashing lights and winter static, he understood something that unsettled him more than the bag itself. The dog was not afraid for herself. She was afraid for them. The explosives unit arrived nearly 50 minutes later through blinding snowfall and highway ice thick enough to rattle the suspension of every vehicle that crossed it. By then the checkpoint looked less like a routine winter stop and more like a lonely island of emergency lights stranded in the middle of white wilderness. Snow had buried the lower halves of the cruisers. Wind moaned through the pine trees lining the highway shoulders, carrying the sharp scent of frost and diesel across the frozen night. Ethan Mercer stood beside the bus door with snow clinging to the edges of his gloves while 2 technicians from North Bay carefully unloaded reinforced cases from the back of their response truck. Neither man spoke much. Veterans never did during nights like this. One technician, a broad older specialist named Ravi Singh, adjusted his visor against the blowing snow and looked toward the bus windows. "Dog still inside?" Ethan nodded once. "She refuses to leave the bag." Ravi studied the dim silhouette of the Doberman visible through the frosted glass. "That usually means she is very certain." The words settled heavily in the cold air. Inside the roadside maintenance station, passengers watched nervously through fogged windows while officers kept everyone calm with coffee, blankets, and quiet reassurances. Nobody complained anymore. Fear had drained irritation out of the room hours ago. Ethan climbed back onto the bus, with Ravi and the second technician moving carefully behind him. Every footstep sounded unnaturally loud against the rubber flooring. The heating system hummed overhead, dry and mechanical, while faint chemical bitterness still lingered beneath the ordinary smell of travel and winter clothing. The Doberman immediately shifted farther back from the duffel bag the moment Ravi entered. Not retreating in panic. Yielding space. Her amber eyes tracked every movement of the technicians with intense concentration. Ravi stopped several meters from the bag and slowly knelt near the aisle. His gloved hand hovered briefly near the floor vent. Then he looked toward Ethan. "You were right about the smell." Ethan did not answer. He already knew. The younger technician carefully extended a portable detection wand toward the duffel while Ravi inspected the zipper seams with a flashlight. The bus fell silent except for the storm rattling softly outside. Then came a faint electronic chirp from the detector. Nobody moved for a second. Ravi exhaled slowly. "There is definitely reactive material in there." The younger technician swallowed hard beneath his face shield. "Improvised triggers maybe." Ravi nodded once. "Looks likely." Ethan felt the cold tighten behind his ribs despite the heated bus. Outside, emergency lights rotated endlessly through the snowfall while officers expanded the perimeter farther down the highway. Another transport truck slowed almost a kilometer away before being redirected southbound by flares and barricades. Northern Ontario winters had a strange way of making even danger feel isolated from the rest of the world, as though the storm itself swallowed human events before they could fully exist. Ravi carefully worked a small fiber optic camera through the partially loosened zipper. The monitor flickered softly in the dim aisle. Ethan watched the older technician's expression change first. Not fear exactly. Recognition. Professional concern. Ravi lowered the screen slightly. "You should see this." Ethan stepped closer beside him. Inside the bag sat tightly packed bundles wrapped in vacuum-sealed plastic alongside compact electronic components, rechargeable battery packs, police frequency printouts, laminated route schedules, and 2 disguised triggering devices hidden inside ordinary travel toiletry containers. No ticking timer. No dramatic wires. Just organized preparation. Calm. Intentional. Ethan stared at the printed highway schedules for several long seconds. Ontario Provincial Police Patrol routes. Winter transport checkpoints. Emergency response frequencies. Somebody had gathered operational details carefully. Deliberately. Ravi's voice dropped lower now. This was not random smuggling. Ethan felt the weight of that truth settle heavily inside him. The unattended bag was not simply dangerous. It was targeted. The younger technician carefully adjusted the camera angle again. There is enough material here to hurt a lot of people if mishandled. Silence followed those words. Outside, the wind screamed across the highway barriers while snow hammered softly against the windows. Then Ethan noticed movement beside him. The Doberman had finally relaxed slightly for the first time all night. Not fully, but enough that the rigid tension in her shoulders eased beneath the flickering bus lights. She slowly lowered herself onto the floor near the aisle, though her eyes never completely left the open bag. Ethan looked down at her quietly. "You knew," he murmured. The dog blinked once, exhausted now, as though the burden of carrying the warning alone was finally beginning to lift. Then Ravi suddenly leaned closer toward the tactical collar around her neck. "Officer," he said softly. "You may want to look at this." Ethan crouched beside the Doberman while snowlight shimmered faintly across the worn nylon strap around her neck. Nearly hidden beneath road salt and age were faded stitched letters barely visible anymore. Ethan brushed the collar gently with his glove. And the moment the old identification name slowly appeared beneath the dirt, the color drained from his face. The faded letters stitched into the old tactical collar looked almost erased by time and winter road salt, but Ethan Mercer recognized the name instantly. Vesper. Beneath it, barely visible near the buckle, sat a second line worn thin from years of use. K9 Unit North District. Ethan stared at the collar while cold moved slowly through his chest like drifting snow settling over buried ground. Ravi looked between the officer and the dog carefully. "You know her?" Ethan did not answer at first. Outside the bus, wind battered the checkpoint barriers while emergency lights pulsed across the frozen highway in endless waves of red and blue. Somewhere beyond the storm, another transport truck groaned through the dark. Life continuing. Oblivious. But inside the bus, time seemed to narrow around the old collar and the exhausted Doberman lying silently beside it. Ethan crouched lower. Vesper lifted her tired amber eyes toward him. And suddenly he was no longer standing on a stranded coach outside North Bay. He was back in Ottawa nearly 12 years earlier, younger. Then, still carrying academy confidence instead of quiet regret. He remembered crowded K9 training grounds covered in early spring rain. The sharp smell of wet asphalt. Tactical instructors shouting commands over barking dogs. And beside all of it stood Sergeant Nolan Pierce. Tall. Calm. The kind of officer who never wasted words because his presence already carried enough weight for everyone nearby. Nolan had been Ethan's mentor during advanced tactical support rotations. He taught younger officers how to read rooms before entering them. How to trust silence. How to trust dogs even more. Vesper had been Nolan's partner back then. Not a German shepherd like most tactical units used. A Doberman. Leaner. Faster. Unusually sensitive to chemical scent patterns. Some officers doubted the choice at first. Until she started outperforming nearly every detection dog in the district. Ethan remembered the first time Nolan let him work beside her during a warehouse operation near Kingston. While officers searched crates manually, Vesper stopped cold beside an untouched shipping container no human suspected. Inside they discovered illegal chemical stockpiles hidden beneath ordinary freight pallets. Nolan had only smiled afterward and scratched behind the dog's ears once. "She notices what fear smells like," he had said quietly. Ethan swallowed hard now as those memories returned beneath the flickering bus lights. Claire Bouchard climbed aboard just as the realization settled fully across his face. "What is it?" she asked softly. Ethan looked up slowly. "Her name is Vesper." Claire frowned faintly. "You know this dog?" Ethan nodded once. "She belonged to Sergeant Nolan Pierce." Silence followed immediately. Even Ravi's expression changed at the mention of the name. Most Northern Ontario officers remembered Nolan Pierce. 3 years earlier he had died during a coordinated roadside operation near Thunder Bay involving illegal chemical transport routes moving through winter freight corridors. Official reports called it a catastrophic tactical incident during severe weather conditions. But many officers quietly believed something else had happened that night. Mistakes. Missed warnings. Bad information passed too quickly through exhausted chains of command. Ethan had not spoken Nolan's name aloud in over 2 years. Claire folded her arms slowly. I thought the dog disappeared after the incident. She did, Ethan answered quietly. Search teams never found her. He looked down at Vesper again. The Doberman rested against the bus floor now, visibly exhausted after hours of tension and cold, yet her eyes remained alert. Despite everything. Ethan noticed scars along her front leg hidden beneath short black fur. Old injuries. Healed badly. His throat tightened unexpectedly. Where have you been, girl? He whispered. Vesper's ears twitched faintly at the sound of his voice. Then she did something that made Ethan's chest ache in a way he had not expected. Slowly, carefully, the Doberman shifted closer and rested her chin against the toe of his winter boot. Not obedience. Recognition. Outside, snow swirled harder around the stranded checkpoint while officers moved equipment beneath harsh floodlights. But inside the bus, the noise seemed very far away now. Ethan stared at the old collar again while memory settled heavily over him. Nolan Pierce had trusted this dog with his life. And somehow, after disappearing into the aftermath of a deadly operation years earlier, Vesper had found her way back onto a winter bus carrying evidence tied to another planned attack against police officers. Ethan felt the terrible shape of coincidence beginning to disappear. This was no accident. The Doberman had not wandered onto that bus by chance. She had followed something. Tracked something. Or someone. Then Ravi's radio crackled sharply through the silence. We just received preliminary intelligence from Toronto Task Force, came the voice through static. The materials inside the duffel may connect to an organized network targeting provincial transport checkpoints. Claire looked toward Ethan immediately. But Ethan's eyes never left the exhausted dog resting against his boot. Because deep down, beneath the storm and sirens and fear, one impossible thought had already begun taking shape inside him. Vesper had been trying to finish something her partner never got the chance to stop. The storm finally began to weaken sometime after 3 in the morning, though the sky above northern Ontario still hung heavy and colorless like bruised steel waiting for dawn. Snow drifted softly now instead of lashing sideways across the highway, and the silence that followed felt almost sacred after hours of sirens, radios, and controlled fear. The dangerous materials had been secured inside reinforced containment cases. Federal investigators were already on their way north from Toronto. Most passengers sat wrapped in blankets inside the maintenance station, exhausted and pale beneath fluorescent lights, speaking in low voices as though anything louder might wake the memory of what almost happened. But Ethan Mercer remained inside the stranded coach beside Vesper. The bus heater had finally shut down to conserve power, leaving the air cold enough that faint clouds followed every breath. Frost crept slowly across the corners of the windows. Outside, police lights still turned silently over the snowbanks, painting soft blue and red reflections across the empty aisle. Ethan sat on one of the forward seats holding an old tablet Claire had retrieved from district archives through emergency network access. The screen glowed faintly against his tired face while wind brushed gently against the roof overhead. Vesper lay near his boots, her breathing slower now, exhaustion finally pulling at the edges of her vigilance. Ethan scrolled carefully through old operational files tied to Nolan Pierce. Training records. Tactical deployments. Incident summaries. Most of it blurred together after a while beneath years of paperwork and official language. But then he stopped. One image appeared on the screen, dated almost 4 years earlier. Nolan stood beside Vesper near a snow-covered checkpoint outside Thunder Bay. The same tactical harness. The same alert amber eyes. Nolan's hand rested gently against the side of her neck while winter sunlight reflected across untouched snow behind them. Ethan stared at the photograph for a long time. He remembered that day. Nolan had called him afterward complaining about endless overtime shifts and freezing patrol routes. "One day this dog is going to retire before I do," he had joked quietly over the phone. Ethan swallowed hard. Nolan never got the chance. Beside him, Vesper slowly lifted her head. Her tired eyes fixed on the glowing tablet screen almost immediately. Ethan noticed the change in her posture. Attention. Recognition. Carefully, he lowered the device slightly toward her. You remember him, do you not? He whispered. Vesper stared at the image without moving. Then, slowly, the Doberman rose from the floor despite obvious fatigue and stepped closer to the seat. Ethan felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. The dog pressed her nose gently against the corner of the screen where Nolan's hand rested beside her younger self. Not confusion. Not curiosity. Memory. The bus suddenly felt impossibly quiet around them. Outside, snowflakes drifted beneath highway floodlights in slow silent spirals while officers moved like distant shadows across the checkpoint perimeter. Ethan stared at the old photograph while years of guilt settled heavily through him. After Nolan's death, Ethan had transferred out of tactical response within 6 months. He told people burnout was the reason. Long shifts. Too much pressure. But the truth sat deeper than that. Ethan had ignored his own instincts during Nolan's final operation. Reports suggested unstable chemical movement routes weeks earlier, but command pressure pushed the operation forward too quickly. Ethan remembered almost calling Nolan the night before the checkpoint deployment. Almost warning him the intelligence felt incomplete. Almost asking him to wait for another support unit before proceeding into the storm. But he never made the call. And by morning, Nolan Pierce was gone. Ethan lowered his eyes quietly. I should have said something, he murmured into the cold air. Vesper turned away from the tablet then and looked directly at him. Her amber eyes reflected the faint blue pulse of distant emergency lights through the frosted windows. No judgment lived there. No blame. Just quiet attention. Then, with slow deliberate movement, the Doberman stepped closer and rested her head gently against Ethan's knee. The contact was soft enough to almost break him. Ethan closed his eyes briefly while one gloved hand moved uncertainly toward the side of her neck. Vesper did not flinch. Did not pull away. She simply stayed there beside him while the storm outside finally began losing its voice. Somewhere beyond the checkpoint, dawn waited beyond the pine forests and frozen highway lanes. Ethan looked back down at the old photograph glowing softly in his hand. Nolan smiling faintly beside the young Doberman years before fear and winter and loss scattered everything apart. Then Ethan whispered the words he should have spoken long ago. I am sorry, partner. And for the first time that night, Vesper finally closed her eyes. Dawn arrived slowly over Highway 17, pale winter light spreading across the snow-covered pines like quiet forgiveness settling over the earth. The storm had finally passed east sometime after sunrise, leaving behind a world softened by fresh snow and silence. The stranded bus remained parked near the checkpoint beneath layers of frost, surrounded now by investigators, transport officials, and weary officers carrying paper cups of coffee through the bitter morning cold. The passengers had already been transferred south on another coach shortly after first light. Some shook Ethan Mercer's hand before leaving. Others simply nodded toward the Doberman resting near the front cruiser as though words no longer felt large enough for what the night had become. News of the intercepted operation spread quickly through provincial channels. By morning, investigators confirmed the materials recovered from the duffel were connected to a coordinated network targeting isolated winter transport checkpoints across Ontario and Manitoba. Police frequencies. Patrol schedules. Chemical trigger devices disguised as ordinary travel items. Quiet preparations for something terrible. But for Ethan, the loudest truth from the night still sat silently beside his cruiser wrapped in a thermal blanket. Vesper slept curled against the rear passenger seat with one paw stretched forward as sunlight flickered softly across her dark coat through the window glass. A veterinarian from North Bay had examined her an hour earlier. Mild frost exposure. Dehydration. Old untreated injuries. Signs of months, maybe years, surviving rough conditions alone. Yet somehow she had endured long enough to find that bus. Long enough to stop what others never even saw coming. Ethan stood beside the cruiser holding another cup of cooling coffee while snow crunched softly beneath approaching boots. Claire Bouchard stopped beside him, exhaustion visible beneath her eyes. Federal team wants your statement by noon, she said quietly. Ethan nodded absent-mindedly. His attention remained on the sleeping Doberman. Claire followed his gaze through the cruiser window. Animal Services already asked where she goes after medical clearance. Ethan looked down at the steaming coffee for a long moment before answering. She already had a partner once. Claire studied him carefully. And now? Ethan glanced toward the highway stretching north between endless white forests and drifting morning mist. For years he had driven these roads feeling like a man moving through borrowed time. Shift after shift. Storm after storm. Quietly carrying the guilt of one missed phone call and one dead mentor whose absence never truly left him. But sometime during the long frozen night beside that exhausted Doberman, something inside him had shifted. Not erased. Just softened. Like ice beginning to crack beneath spring sunlight. Ethan looked back toward the cruiser window again. Vesper had opened her eyes quietly and was watching him now. Calm. Alert. Waiting. Claire's voice gentled slightly. You know, Mercer, some dogs only ever listen to one person. Ethan smiled faintly for the first time in a very long while. Yeah, he said softly. I think she has already decided. An hour later, after the final reports were signed and the checkpoint barriers removed, Ethan opened the rear cruiser door carefully. Cold morning air drifted inside carrying the scent of pine, snow, and distant wood smoke from somewhere far beyond the highway. Vesper lifted her head slowly. Ethan crouched beside her. Come on, girl, he murmured. Let us get you somewhere warm. The Doberman studied his face for a quiet second before stepping carefully out onto the snow-covered pavement. Her movements remained stiff from exhaustion, but the alertness in her eyes had returned. Ethan reached into the front seat and pulled out an extra winter blanket, draping it gently across her shoulders against the cold. Vesper leaned into the touch only slightly, but it was enough. Around them, officers loaded equipment while transport trucks once again thundered north beneath pale morning skies. Ordinary life returning to the highway. Yet Ethan lingered there another moment beside the Doberman beneath the fading emergency lights. Then his radio crackled softly from his shoulder. Good work tonight, Mercer. Ethan looked down at Vesper standing quietly beside him in the drifting snow. The old tactical collar around her neck glimmered faintly beneath the morning sun. He shook his head once and rested a gloved hand gently against her shoulder. No, he said quietly. She did the work. Vesper looked up at him then, amber eyes calm beneath the endless Canadian winter sky, and together they walked toward the cruiser while snow fell softly around them like the world, at last, had decided to let two tired souls come home.